Have you ever found yourself reading the same paragraph 3 times without absorbing a single word? Or maybe perhaps you've just sat through an entire meeting only to realize that you have no idea about what was discussed. Maybe have you ever started a simple task on your computer and then somehow found yourself 45 minutes later down a rabbit hole of completely unrelated information? Or maybe you've just experienced the opposite, those rare, precious moments of complete immersion where time seems to disappear and your mind works with incredible clarity. Maybe have you ever wondered why some days your attention feels sharp and focused, while on others it seems to scatter like the leaves in the wind? Welcome to Deep Thinking with Dr. Stephen Stolz, where academic rigour meets real life. I'm Dr. Stephen Stolz, educator, philosopher and academic at the University of Adelaide, and this podcast series is my quest to help everyday people access research-based ideas that feed curiosity and foster deep thinking. In today's episode, I'll explore the science and structure of attention. Then I'll challenge some common myths about attention and flow, revealing what science tells us about achieving states of optimal focus and attention. So join me as I bridge the gap between evidence-based research and everyday application. This is Deep Thinking with Dr. Stephen Stolz. I love my iPhone. In fact, I'm holding it right now and I'm just looking at it as I'm talking about it. But recently, I nearly smashed my iPhone against the wall because it was constantly distracting me. And I noticed that the more I used it, the harder it was for me to stay focused or present. Now, this really bothered and annoyed me. It was like my iPhone and our digital society had destroyed my attention span completely. And my mind and brain had been hacked without my permission. I feel like there's this kind of battle of attention going on. Over the years, I've noticed this in my classrooms with students' heads constantly in their phones and not really paying attention to what I'm teaching or to even their own learning. If you don't believe me, just turn up to any lecture at any university and you will see the same thing being played out around the world. Indeed, you only need to catch public transport to observe the battle for attention that is going on. Recently, I was on a tram heading home from work, and I remember looking around the crowded tram, and I noticed everyone was on their phone. It's a pretty common scene today. And as I was standing there, I could notice a few younger people who looked like some of my university students who are on their phones. And I couldn't see what was on their phones very clearly because I didn't have my glasses on, but I could kind of make out their behaviour on the phone. And now I promise I wasn't sticky beaking. It was because they were sitting down and every now and then I would glance over and I would just see what they were doing on their phone, just to kind of pass the time. I was a little bit bored. And what caught my attention was how quickly they were scrolling through endless video feeds on what looked like to be TikTok and then Instagram and other social media platforms. In fact, that's actually what caught my attention, how quickly they move between the different platforms. So I watched on and off. I looked over to see what they were doing, and I noticed that they would spend approximately 4 to 5 seconds on each kind of screen, and then they would quickly dispatch it, like the movement of their thumb, like they're throwing a piece of rubbish into the bin. And then I noticed that they would then quickly change to text messages and read that quickly, and then they would flick back to another screen. And I was amazed at how quickly and how rapidly they were changing between the screens. In fact, I felt absolutely mortified because I saw that type of behaviour in myself and how I use my own iPhone. Modern life and the digital world seem to drive attention and focus away. Daily, I'm bombarded with a lot of information and messages that leaves me feeling exhausted, and my endless battle to empty my inbox just seems like a futile task. Ironically, technology was designed to augment our capacities or capabilities and to help us be more productive, but instead we feel distracted and exhausted. When it comes to the attention in the modern world, particularly attention in the digital world, I was left wondering the following. Why is it that we may feel in control of our lives in the physical world, but don't feel in control of our attention in the digital world? Why do we have the illusion that we can do more, particularly when we extend our attention to multitasking? Despite the fact that multitasking has repeatedly been shown to be associated with lower performance, increased stress, and burnout. I wonder how we can take back control of our attention in this digital world. I'm always reminded by the science, which makes it quite clear that our attention spans have declined in duration when we use our devices. For instance, our attention spans, whilst on digital devices, have become crazy short, to the point we spend 47 seconds on average on any screen. This is true for everyone, whether you are Gen X, Gen Y, Gen Z, or Millennials and Gen Alpha. While there is no shortage of advice on different exercise routines to get you shredded, diets to lose weight, and so on, I found it surprisingly difficult to find any useful or practical information about how to build and replenish my capacity for paying attention, find focus, and to fight distraction. This is why I wanted to do this episode on attention and share my own findings with you about how I reclaimed my attention. In preparation for this episode, a colleague from the US knew I was doing an episode on attention. And so he sent me an article from the New Yorker magazine titled The Battle for Attention. And the details of the article will be in the episode descriptor. I'll make sure producer Luke, the truckie from Petrie, has that information. Now, what interests me about this article was a secret international society called the Order of the Third Bird, or the Birds. Now, the order's name alludes to a piece of lore about three birds confronting a painting by the ancient artist Zeus. And the first was frightened away by the painting. The second approached to try to eat painted fruit that exists within the painting. And the third just looked. And what is interesting about the birds is that they are concerned with widespread loss of attention. And so hence reference to the third part of that lore, where the third bird just looked at the painting, and hence where the name of the society comes from. Now, apparently, this secret society goes back centuries, and it mainly consists of artists and academics. Now, participants in the birds, when they actually do an activity concerned with attention, they would converge flash mob style, say at museums or art galleries, and they would stare intensely at a work of art, say, for instance, if it was an art gallery, for half an hour, and then they would vanish afterwards. From what I can work out, participants of the birds would meet at an action site. That's what they would call it. And that could be anything like from an art gallery to a museum. And then they would engage in a 4-step process. And each step or phase would last approximately 7 minutes each, and it would be a total of 28 minutes. And the 4 steps involved encounter, attending, negation, and realizing. So what does each step involve? So from what I can work out, when the participants arrive at the designated location, say it's a art gallery, the birds are supposed to find the stimulus material by encountering it in a space. Then comes attending, announced by the first bell. And so for 7 minutes, they silently give the work their full and undivided attention. The second bell heralds the start of negation, a phase in which the birds try to clear the object from their minds. At the third bell, 7 minutes later, the group reconvenes to observe the work of art or object for realizing by focusing entirely on the object itself and not its history or meaning. And at the final bell, the birds disperse and they fly away and leave the scene to find somewhere quiet to sit and write down their experiences of the 4 phases. A short while later, participants usually meet up, say at a cafe, where they take turns describing what they went through, their experiences, what distractions they encountered, if they had any distractions, and any other kind of relevant information from the 4 phases that they had just been through together. Now, I'm not too sure what to make of the birds just yet. However, there's something fascinating about what they're doing that piqued my interest. And coincidentally, I came across one of the participants who were engaging in a sound experiment using the 4 stages. And I went through that sound experiment with the participant, and I found it extremely difficult and yet at the same time rewarding. It actually made me realize that when it comes to my own attention, that I have a lot of work to do. And so when they talk about the 4 phases of encounter, attending, negation, and realizing, funny enough, there is a lot of overlap with some of the practical and evidence-based approaches that I will outline in this episode on regaining our attention in a distracted world. And I want to point out before I move on to my next part of this episode, and I just want to mention that any information that I have found on the birds, I will make sure that I share that with producer Luke, and I'll make sure that is in the episode descriptor so you can search for it yourself. Now, if you're listening into this and you're wondering, what's the difference between attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, or is commonly referred to as ADHD, and say a lack of attention? Well, then I think it's important that you come to a realization there are important differences between the two. So, for instance, ADHD is a neurodevelopmental condition that's characterized by persistent and significant challenges with inattention and the hyperactivity, hence why it's called hyperactivity disorder, and impulsivity or lack of impulse control that actually has a significant impact on daily functioning and well-being. Now, that is part of what they call a psychiatric condition. And in order to be diagnosed with ADHD, you would, at least where I am, you would have to go see a psychiatrist, and they would use the Diagnostic Statistical Manual, which has very, very strict criteria around what's involved in order for someone to actually be diagnosed with ADHD. And they would be the professional or the healthcare professional who would make that diagnosis of ADHD. And there are a whole range of different interventions. Some of us, you might be familiar with, one being Ritalin, which is a oral prescription medication used to calm ADHD people down enough to at least attend to what they're doing, or at least concentrate. And that is a pretty common treatment plan that psychiatrists engage with patients who have ADHD. In terms of attention, well, there are a number of things here. So attention, of course, in this instance refers to the ability to focus and concentrate and then have sustained focus over on periods of time on a task. And it's a normal cognitive function that everyone experiences to varying degrees. So if you lack attention, well, the good news is that there are a whole range of different things, quite practical things, which I will talk about towards the end of this episode, that you can do to regain your attention. And so for the majority of us who have attention spans that ebb and flow during the day, well, the good news is that if you have a realization that there are the ebbs and flows of the day, and that there are times where we're at our peak and there are times when we're not at our peak, well, we can then design our day and plan our days around those peaks. And I talk a little bit more about that in this episode. However, what I want to say is that when it comes to ADHD, which is a psychiatric condition, these are things that cannot be controlled without some type of intervention. For instance, say medication or some other treatment plans like neurofeedback, which I talk a little bit about towards the end of this episode. In fact, neurofeedback has had unbelievable amounts of success with ADHD sufferers. In fact, combined with medication, there are excellent outcomes for patients. And so I'd encourage you, if you think that relates to you, or if you have a child, for instance, who may have ADHD or symptoms of ADHD, of course, I would encourage you to go see your healthcare professional, your first stop obviously being your GP, who will then refer you to a psychiatrist who specialises in ADHD. And of course, they can then provide you with further direction around what to do. Now, when it comes to the structure of attention, everyone knows what it is. One thing is clear is that we do have choice over what we pay attention to. It's consequential. So, for example, my experience generally is grounded in what I agree to tend to. So only those items which I notice shape my mind. So without being selectively interested, it's just our life would be utter chaos. And so what's quite obvious here is that we decide to pay attention, and that forms part of our lived experience. So as we move through this world, we are confronted by a host of different kinds of stimuli, and we select what to focus on by our own volition. And that's pretty clear. And so it's worthwhile just mentioning from the get-go that we control where we pay our attention. Now, in terms of our attentional networks, it turns out that attention is actually a system of different networks located in different parts of the brain. And these form our attentional system. So in the attentional system, our attentional networks perform diverse operations. When you try and pay attention to something like focusing on the screens or managing interruptions, first there is alerting, which is used when we maintain vigilance during a task, like trying to concentrate on writing a report or you have a particular deadline. So, of course, you need to be alerted to the task at hand. Next, there's orientating. So you need to prioritize and select stimuli to focus on, such as when we need to find that email from our manager in our inbox that we must answer. So we choose to respond to that email, or if you like, we choose to respond to that notification chime. That's, of course, if you've got it turned on. And then, of course, lastly, we have the executive control, which manages interference of irrelevant stimuli. It's like a filter of sorts, so that we can maintain focus and our attention. So this is very important when it comes to dealing with distractions. So what's going on in relation to our attention then? So one thing that's very clear is that we have limited pool of cognitive resources. And it's well accepted, particularly within psychology, which obviously has a lot to say about this topic, and there's over 50 years of research behind this. It's quite clear that we have a pool of attentional, or if you like, cognitive resources that we use in our everyday functioning. And think of it like this: these resources can be thought of as attentional capacity. So one basic assumption is that these resources are required when we process information. And these pool of resources are limited. Think of the analogy of the fuel tank. I do like the analogy of the fuel tank. And it gives you an indication of how much you have left in your tank of cognitive resources. So think of the gauge in your car. If you have a petrol or diesel car, there is generally a gauge that tells you how much fuel is in your petrol tank. And so when you subjectively feel spent and your performance starts to suffer, your fuel gauge will read near empty. Now, if you're feeling refreshed at the start of the day, and let's hope you've had a very good night's sleep, then generally your fuel gauge will register full. So that analogy of the fuel gauge is apt here. There is no doubt from an intuitive point of view, and I know this from my own personal experiences, that your cognitive resources do drain. Like I said before, generally in the morning, if you had a really good quality night's sleep, you do feel very refreshed, ready to go. And of course, during the day, your performance generally deteriorates because your cognitive resources are being drained. And the theory of limited cognitive resources can explain your performance. So when your workload is high and when your attentional resources are spent, you don't do very much and you have to take a break in order to replenish. And of course, your performance suffers when your cognitive resources are extended or not available. And so this is part or a little bit of what they call cognitive load theory. So in everyday life, your mental performance depends on how much cognitive resources are available. And so, of course, these are affected by things like the type and difficulty of the task that you're engaging in, how many tasks you're attempting to perform at once, and a whole range of other factors, which I will touch on in this episode. The other thing we know is that while we know that switching back and forth between answering emails, for instance, or handling interruptions and completing that quarterly report if you have to write one, they can use up your resources, and other activities can replenish them as well. So some ways of replenishing resources, they do seem rather intuitive. So if you've just returned, for instance, say from work from a relaxing weekend where you've caught up on your sleep, then generally you have sufficient cognitive resources on a Monday morning, or a good night's sleep with a reasonable amount of deep sleep and especially REM sleep. And I would encourage you to listen to the episode on sleep with Dr. Mark Kohler, where he talks about this. Now, these can stockpile resources, that is, sleep, for instance. So when people psychologically detach from a stressful situation, they can also recover their cognitive resources. For instance, going on a vacation, particularly to a peaceful environment, can allow the mind to reset. And I've already spoken about how much I love camping. Camping is a perfect opportunity to reset those cognitive resources. Even a mere 20 minutes of contact with nature can refresh your mind. And I love to just get down to the Botanic Gardens here at lunchtime and sit there and have my lunch. I find that is very, very useful for replenishing my cognitive resources. But you may not realize that playing a simple mindless game like Candy Crush can also allow you to take a break and also replenish your resources. I'm going to talk a little bit about why in a minute. So the next thing to think about is sustained versus kinetic attention. Now, of course, I care about, at least anyway, sustained attention, at least how we can regain sustained attention in a world of distraction. And one way of thinking about this is kinetic attention, and this is the best way of thinking about it, refers to a dynamic state of attention characterized by rapid shifts. It's a bit like that example I gave before of the person on the tram who was changing rapidly between screens and different platforms. And so when you rapidly shift, like say between applications or social media or internet sites or whatever, or between the computer and the phone, these can be really, really draining on your cognitive resources. And so in and of itself, kinetic attention is neither good or bad. I think that's pretty clear. It's just a simple descriptor of real-world attention behavior. And in many ways, it could be said that kinetic attention is an adaptive response to a wealth of information and distractions that are really created in this digital world that we live in today. And it's just an attempt for us to kind of deal with it, really. And so the problem, of course, is that it can have a negative impact on our stress levels. It can make us fatigued. It can lead to poor performance. And, of course, burnout, which I care a lot about. And so that's a nice little segue into the battle for our attention. It's a bit like I said earlier on in this episode. I swear, sometimes it's just a battle just to pay attention on what I need to get done. And so when we do tasks, for instance, that might be unfamiliar or difficult, we engage in what's called control processing, which uses cognitive resources and it uses a lot of them. So take, for example, when I'm driving a new route, and even if I outsource my cognitive load or thinking to my car's navigation system, I still have to pay attention to follow the navigation system. And then obviously I need to make sure I'm not distracted. And so the cognitive load is very high. Automatic processing obviously helps me, as in automatic processing of doing easy and well-learned and familiar tasks. For instance, driving a car has become automatic because I've been driving long enough. However, when you perform the same actions over and over again, like checking email or driving a familiar route, and that becomes very automatic. And so it doesn't really deplete our attentional resources. And I know producer Luke, the truckie from Petrie, loves it when I talk about driving. But then if we suddenly the light turns yellow or amber, then we need to be flexible enough to allocate our attention to hit the brakes and stop. And then so this type of automatic attention is called exogenesis attention. It's usually driven by some kind of external stimulus, like the traffic light. And so most people will understand that example, particularly producer Luke, the truckie from Petrie. Now, how can I keep our attention on our goals? Well, our ability to perform a hard task, like writing a report or even writing a book, and I know a lot about all those kind of things, involves maintaining that goal in your mind. So when we direct our attention to a goal in a top-down manner, this is called endogenous attention. So that originates within, or it's internal. So if my goal is to work on the paper or a book that I'm writing or whatever, I would then allocate my attention to writing, reading, searching, researching, and so on, and doing whatever I need to do to reach that goal. But when we simply react to a stimulus, like in the environment automatically, like a phone calls or text notifications, then our attention is not goal-directed, but rather stimulus-driven in a bottom-up manner. And this is called exogenesis attention, originating from the outside or externally. This is the example I gave before of the driving. Now, this is the same type of experience when we're driving and we had to suddenly change the traffic light to yellow, like I said before. And so this is an important difference here. So we have endogenous attention, so that's something I have control over. And then, of course, we're exogenesis or external stimuli that can also gain our attention. And so these two things are very important. This distinction are very important here because it then means it gives us an understanding of what's called attention traps. So let's turn to some specific reasons why we have trouble managing our attention, particularly in this digital world of distractions. And I'm thinking here of devices in particular. And I think you might relate to some of these, particularly as we live in a digital world. And I don't know many people who don't have multiple devices. In fact, it's actually quite common to not only have multiple devices like smartphones, laptops, smart devices at homes. It's a very long list. And I think of all the devices we have at our home at the moment, way too many. Anyway, I guess being a modern family, that's becoming more and more common. I also think of educational systems that make it compulsory to have certain devices. But anyway, we'll put that to one side for a moment. Now, these is worth reflecting on in relation to your own behaviour and something maybe to avoid. So first one is around what's called framing errors. So when you make a conscious decision to do something, so for instance, I want to write a book or write this paper or a report, you likely frame your choice, but you probably don't realise you're doing it so much. And so sometimes we just react automatically to stimuli like notifications that are chiming. And sometimes we just don't have a chance to frame our choice. It's a bit like what I said before about endogenous, if you like, internal choices that we make, and then exogenous, originating from the outside, so stimulus. So think of notifications if you do have a notification chime on your phone. But even then, if you put it on silent, your phone can still vibrate. And of course, there are other external stimuluses beyond smartphones. But look, your situation, your emotional state, and your mental energy all set the stage and generally will influence likely what you choose to do. So whether you respond to that chime notification or a notification on your phone or your laptop or whatever. So if the start of the workday and you don't feel pumped up with the energy quite yet, then you might choose to take on something easy before starting hard work. If, however, it's 4 o'clock and you are feeling emotionally drained after a day of meetings, and I know all about back-to-back meetings and how draining they can be, your perspective might stem from what you could do to relieve exhaustion. So we get caught up in certain kinds of behaviours or patterns where we tend to feel like we've lost control of our attention. So it starts with how we frame our choices of what actions to take. So framing refers, if you like, to a particular perspective you give to the context in which you choose. Here's an example. Say you have a pressing deadline coming at work and your friend calls to invite you to take a weekend getaway. Now, you could frame the choice of taking the weekend getaway in a positive way, as taking a break and then relaxing to help you, say, perform better during the week. Or you could just frame the choice more negatively, as in, oh, it's taking time away from working towards that deadline. And so that's a little bit about what they refer to as emotional valence that we attach to certain attentive choices we make. And of course, that connects with certain things around what they call the attention wandering trap. So it's quite obvious. Well, I wouldn't say it's obvious, but I think if you are self-aware, you may have come to this realization that our attention just naturally wanders. Our attention naturally wanders between external stimuli and our internal thoughts. It's actually quite common. Our mind wanders a lot, and that's quite a normal thing. In fact, mind wandering in a strict sense is when people's attention is focused inward. And it is so commonplace that people can spend anywhere between 25 to about 50% of their thinking during the waking hours just mind wandering. That's a big number, isn't it? Anywhere between 25 50%. And that's why I mention it here, because it is relevant. And look, there are so many digital activities that kind of capture our attention, that engages with this attention wandering. For example, if you happen to read an article on your favourite sports team, and I know producer Luke, the truckie from Petrie, he loves to send me all sorts of things, particularly around his favourite footy team, the Bombers. Then you may start to think about the next game you can go to. Oh, yeah, when's the next game? So you might go to the AFL website if you follow the football. That's the Australian rules football. And then you go off and search for tickets and then other related topics to catch your attention. And by the way, it doesn't have to be football. I'm just mentioning football as an example. It could be soccer. It could be anything. It could be netball. And then you end up in internet meandering. And you likely have made the second framing error of failing to predict the amount of time you would likely spend surfing the internet when you made the choice to do so. Because you're so absorbed, you might not even thought about the time at all. Before you know it, something that you thought might take 5 minutes has turned into 2 hours. I've been there before. And so people with good executive control, remember executive control, which is the function that controls distractions, are able to focus more on external tasks and are better able to prevent mind wandering and potentially incessant web surfing along with it. Now, we're especially prone to this type of attention wandering when we are low on cognitive resources. In fact, it tends to happen more so when we are tired and towards the end of the day, all those ebbs and flows, and which I'll talk to you about in a minute. And of course, research has found that meditative practices such as mindfulness techniques can be actually really effective in controlling mind wandering. And I'm going to do an episode on meditation and mindfulness techniques. And so a bit before I mentioned rote attention activities, playing games like Candy Crush. Now, as much as people think that's a waste of time, just be careful. Sometimes it actually can help with replenishing our cognitive resources. So we just need to be careful. There is good and bad rote attention traps or rote attention activities. So another common behavioural pattern happens when people report not being able to readily stop doing easy and engaging activities on their devices. Just kind of think maybe Candy Crush or some kind of rote activity on a device. So playing simple online games, like Candy Crush for instance, and browsing social media sites do engage our attention and can help us to step us back or help us deal with stressful work and, like I said before, replenish our attentional resources. And so when you scan, for instance, say Twitter posts, or you do some kind of routine actions over and over again, say like in a simple game, in either case, you experience little or perhaps no challenge. Now, you might see such rote activity as a good choice when you feel your cognitive resources are low. Now, these rote activities involve a type of stimulus response behaviour that includes immediate gratification. For instance, simple rewards such as laughter, earning points, achieving a new playing level, or just winning the game. Now, these further the great satisfaction, and the stronger our connection to that behavior, of course, the stronger that attention becomes. And of course, you have a positive emotional valence to playing these type of games. And the same applies also to social media trap. Now, quite a few people report that they feel their attention is trapped when they use social media. So we are drawn to social media and texting because look, at the end of the day, we are social beings, and we really do crave that social support that they can provide us, and they connect us socially. They socially connected us. And of course, there's a social capital, and we just are curious about others, really. And so ideally, look, we can use social media to take breaks and connect to others. And we can use it to support our work and support our goals. And we could choose to go on social media, but we need to be aware that there are good and bad instances of usage. So we can get caught in that trap, which can be negative. And another trap is an identity trap. So another behavioral pattern that I hear about more often from young people is that they spend a lot of time and attention on designing and maintaining their online personas. So for young people in particular, online identities are important this is how they present themselves to the social group in the world. And so that just makes sense. But online identity is important to people of all ages. So I shouldn't point out that it's just young people, for example, but LinkedIn is a perfect example where we present a work identity. And of course, there's what's called the sunk cost trap. You already maybe have devoted a lot of time and your attention on a site or playing a game that you feel it could waste or pull your attention away. So you kind of like double down and go, oh, look, I've already spent so much time on this already. And so you kind of lose a little bit of control of your actions, where you're unable to stop watching, say, TikTok, or you spend too much time on Wikipedia or just shopping sites. And that becomes really detrimental. And so this is how it's important to consider your framing errors. It's important to consider these framing errors and see if you have fallen into any of these traps yourself that I've mentioned. And I always think of just recently, I haven't become obsessed by this guy, Luke Nichols. He got a YouTube channel called The Outdoor Boys. Big fan. I think Luke is fantastic. However, the reason why I love this YouTube channel is because I love to go camping, and in this channel, he shares his experiences of going camping with his kids and family. And he goes to all sorts of extreme climates. For instance, the recent one I just watched was in Alaska, where he tried to survive just using a blanket and a few implements in the winter of Alaska. Some pretty extreme weather. And he records all of this. I can imagine he'll get hours and hours of footage, but I find it very relaxing. But then I also realized that something I just wanted to watch for 15 minutes turned into 2 hours. So that's definitely example of myself getting caught in one of those traps. All right, so let's turn our attention to types of attention. I think this is really important. Now, there's a theoretical framework of attention states that are based on Gloria Mark's work, and the work that's titled Attention Span. I'll make sure it goes in the descriptor of this episode. I'll make sure that gets to producer Luke, the Truckee from Petrie. It provides a framework to describe different kinds of attentional experiences that we all encounter in the digital world. And in the book, she has a diagram. And in that diagram, that shows 2 dimensions of the amount of engagement and the amount of challenge in a theoretical framework. And these are temporal states. And so people generally fluctuate across these attentional states throughout the day, depending on their goals, their tasks, their interactions, and then just inner thoughts and a whole range of other factors. And so in this diagram, I just want you to think on the y-axis, we have a high engagement at the northern end, or the high at the top, and at the bottom, we have low engagement. And then on the x-axis, on the right-hand side, as you look at the diagram, you have high challenge. And then on the left-hand side of the continuum, or if you like, is low challenge. And you have 4 quadrants. And in these 4 quadrants, I'll start with focus. So when people are highly engaged and highly challenged, we call this attentional state focus. And that's generally the upper right-hand quadrant as you look at the diagram. And so focus obviously is something we care a lot about, hence the episode, of course. But focus represents a temporal state when people feel absorbed in an activity and the activity requires some degree of challenge to a person's skill set. So just remember x-axis to the right hand of the diagram, just think high challenge, high engagement. That gives us focus. This is important to remember that this is not the same as flow. And I'll talk to you a little bit more about that in a minute. So one can be focused, such as when we're trying to read an instruction manual, and trying to assemble something for the first time, without experiencing the conditions of flow. So you could just be deeply engrossed in the instruction manual that you're trying to put something together. For instance, I was trying to assemble a IKEA bookshelf the other day with my daughter. And I tell you what, IKEA, that really had my attention. I can tell you that right now. And I was drained after putting it together, after the cognitive flight of putting it together. So without experiencing conditions of flight, so you could feel deeply creative, but just unaware of the passage of time. And that's optimally uses one skill. So rather, our label of focus is probably better thought of as a type of engagement. That could be a precondition of flow. So I'm not saying it's not part of flow. I'm just saying that it's a precondition of flow. So focus requires high cognitive resources. Then the next quadrant, when people are highly engaged, but not at all challenged. So now we're on the left-hand side of the axis, of the x-axis. We call this a rote attentional state. And that's shown in the upper left quadrant. And the rote activity is mechanical and routine. And it's easy and it can absorb our attention. And similarly, we could be highly engaged in digital activities that are mechanical and repetitive, like I said before, like playing Candy Crush. And so because rote activity involves tasks that are not challenging, this type of attention uses fewer cognitive resources. And this can explain why people can play games like Candy Crush for hours each day without feeling cognitively exhausted. And the next one, let's go to the next quadrant. So when people are not very engaged and not very challenged, we call this state boredom. So this is now, remember, to the left-hand side of the x-axis, and then we're at the bottom of the y-axis, and we're in the quadrant known, or the left-hand, or the lower left-hand quadrant known as boredom. And this could be anything like surfing the internet, flitting from side to side. I think about, home on the TV, trying to find something to watch. You could just be bored, just flicking through the channels and just barely sticking around long enough to read a few sentences. So boredom uses few cognitive resources. And then the last quadrant is frustrated. So when people are highly engaged but they're not engaged in what they're doing, so they are towards the bottom of the y-axis, they are frustrated. So that is the lower right-hand quadrant. So everyone can recall times, I certainly can, when they have been frustrated in their work, feeling like they were just banging their head against the wall and they're not making any progress on anything. So this attentional state, we can use a lot of our resources, and understandably why it can be frustrating. So let's turn to how these types of attentional states can fluctuate throughout the day. It's a logical next step. What has become clear, and the research is quite clear, and thanks to Gloria Mark and her excellent book, Attention Span, but what's quite clear is that across all jobs, people showed two peaks of focus. And the first one is generally around late morning at 11 a.m. And the second one is mid-afternoon at 3 p.m. So rote attention shows a different type of rhythm through much of the day, and generally starting around 9 a.m. when it begins to rise, and then rote activity continues until around 2 p.m. and then declines. Boredom peaks around 1 p.m. right after lunch. And the good news is that throughout the day, on the whole, people were more focused than bored in the workplace. And so if you're an employer, these are things to note. The good news that people are more focused than bored in the workplace, but the not so good news is that it generally report more boredom than rote attention through the day. Ouch. They also found in the research that we have more what's called a rhythm over the week. So people are more focused on a Monday, no surprise there, particularly if you've had a rested weekend and you've replenished the cognitive resources. And they might come back on a Monday, a tank full of cognitive resources. Just think of that analogy of the fuel tank. They might come back with a full fuel tank of cognitive resources, replenished, caught up with great sleep and social interactions and exercise and so on. And after this burst on Monday, it seems that they take a bit of a dive as we progress through the week. We tend to take it easy on Tuesday. Wednesday shows a similar burst of focus. Perhaps the reason Thursday is the day when most activity is done is also to take it easy and replenish our resources. You're already 4 days into the working week, particularly if you work 5 days a week, say Monday to Friday. And I realise not all of us work Monday to Friday, but you would just apply this to the number of days here, whether that's Saturday, Sunday, whatever. I think you get my point. So this could explain why on Friday, say 5 days of continuous work, we see a small burst of focus. And it's even more of a reason why I think it's important to give some serious thought to the 4-day working week or breaking your week up into Monday, Tuesday with a Wednesday, say like an RDO or some break or working from home or some variations. It's great that we are now starting to give some thought to variations of the normal work week. And I think the research is clear that that actually could help productivity. So I don't want to take too much of a tangent away from that, but I do think it's important that we do consider alternatives. I do think the 4-day working week has shown that it can actually boost productivity. So I actually want to advocate for that. So if there's any employers here who are listening to this episode, I just would encourage you to seriously consider what the research says about this, particularly how it can boost productivity. Back to my next point. So attentional states and our susceptibility to distraction. So why do people lose focus and get distracted? That is a logical question to ask. And I think it's a common conception that people might be deeply focused on something, then along comes an interruption, and then afterwards it's just really hard to focus again. And that could lead to boredom and obviously ultimately loss of productivity. But what if a person's particular attentional state makes them susceptible to distractions? Well, three of the most common types of interruptions that research shows were reported were email, Facebook, and face-to-face interactions. And so that's interesting around distractions. And I know from my own personal experience, so whether you've got notifications on your laptop or desktop computer or whatever device, those notifications or even email has been shown to be probably the number one cause of distractions. And that obviously has implications in the workplace. The second one, I know it says Facebook, but that just could be social media. That could be anything from Twitter, which is now known as X, through to Instagram, through to YouTube. It could be anything. And then, of course, face-to-face interactions. Of course, if you're in a busy workplace, well, those face-to-face interactions become more and more frequent. It is really, really important to give some thought to what this means and so how we deal with these distractions. And so I think it's important to give some thought to, ideally, our understanding of why it's important that we should take breaks and give some thought to what this means in relation to distractions. And so what they've found, or I should say what the research has found, is that ideally we should take breaks and leave our devices to replenish our resources, they replenish our cognitive resources. And we also have the power to control how we switch attentional states, and we can try to tap into these innate needs to achieve an inner balance and to recover and replenish these resources. I'll talk to you a little bit more about distractions in a minute and what the research has to say. Now to the elephant in the room around multitasking. What is multitasking? Well, generally, multitasking are activities that are done in parallel or at the same time. And what has become pretty clear, and the research is quite clear on this, is that activities actually cannot be done in parallel or at the same time, unless one or both of those activities require little or no attentional resources, like speaking on the phone while walking, for instance, And don't I see a lot of that around campus? But if I'm talking on the phone and then trying to answer emails, I'm not really doing these simultaneously. I think this was very interesting to me. So what I'm really doing is just switching my attention rapidly between them. And essentially that's what is happening in the multitasking. You are switching rapidly between your tasks. So in multitasking, the mind allocates a lot of attention back and forth to different sources. It could also just be an external stimulus like an email notification, or by something like an internal thing like a memory. You're triggered by a memory, an emotive memory or something. Performing two tasks that require effortful control, it's just not possible for humans to do these well. Think about multitasking from 2 points of view. So remember that attention is goal-directed, and when we switch our perspectives from broad to fine-grained views, for instance, of our tasks, we are switching our goals from high level to low level. So when I'm working, I'm constantly shifting between high and level goals. So something that requires a lot of cognitive load or cognitive demands or cognitive resources, through to low-level things, for instance, like driving my car. I've been driving for years, so it's quite automatic for me to do that. And it's low-level cognitive engagement for me. Our attention spans, interesting enough, have declined over the years. What the research shows is that the average duration of attention, say for instance on a screen, before switching to another screen is declining significantly. So this comes from Gloria Mark's book. She says that in 2004, they found that people averaged about 2.5 minutes on a computer screen before switching their attention to another computer screen. And in 2012, the average went down to 47 seconds. Now that is a big decline. And then in the later years from 2016 to 2021, the average amount of time on any screen before switching was found to be relatively consistent between 44 and 50 seconds. Ouch. That's another decline. So what happens with a distraction? Just think you're in the workplace and you're working on a task and someone comes and knocks on your door, and obviously that is a distraction. And so what happens for you, and how long does it take for you to resume work back on that interrupted task? Well, there's good and bad news here. So the good news is that you generally can return to that interrupted task. That's the good news. You can return to that task. But the bad news is that it takes somewhere around 25 minutes to return to that interrupted task again. And the really, really bad news is that when people get interrupted, they do not just return to another task or return to that same task. They just don't like snap right back into it. What they find is that you actually cycle through different phases. And so you generally kind of cycle through your different aspects until you get back to that original interrupted task. So for instance, you might take a call that you weren't expecting, or again, like I said to you before, like my own example, you work in your office, if you have one, and someone knocks on your door unexpectedly. And so that you switch between different activities. So you might go from, let's say you're working on task A and that was interrupted. Generally, you cycle through another task, think of task B, and then task C, and then generally after about 25 minutes, then you return back to the interrupted task, or if you like, task A. And that takes about 25 minutes. And of course, it burns up a lot of fuel, to use the analogy of the fuel tank. It becomes, you've depleted, your cognitive resources come depleted the more and more interruptions you might encounter on a daily basis. Some people might believe that multitasking helps their productivity. In fact, like I said early on, I don't know why I believe this, but I thought multitasking was just part of the modern workplace. And so I actually believed that illusion. In fact, I don't feel silly about it. I'm actually glad that I came to that realization myself. And I intuitively realized that multitasking was making me exhausted and was draining me. And so I intuitively knew that something wasn't right. So I guess you could say I'm glad that I intuitively worked out that multitasking was not good for productivity. And I'm glad that I've come to that firm realization. It's kind of confirmed what I suspected now, but the research is quite clear on this and has solidified my thinking on this, is that productivity suffers when we engage in multitasking. Of course, the more interruptions you encounter, the quicker the decline in your productivity. And interestingly, and I think this is the bit that I want to emphasize here, is that it's just not productivity that suffers, right? But studies also consistently show that multitasking is associated with higher stress. In fact, your stress levels go through the roof. And I know that intuitively, if you're trying to deal with or trying to get back to work and you're continually being interrupted, definitely your stress levels increase. And I'm going to do an episode on stress. So stay tuned for that episode. But in fact, the faster the attention switching between devices, the higher the stress. So if you're switching between devices very quickly and quite rapidly, yes, definitely increases your stress levels and decreases productivity. So what does that have to do in relation to the everyday workplace and different generations? And in particular, I'm thinking of young children, and I'm thinking of Gen Z, and I'm thinking about that in relation to multitasking. Now, maybe, and this is a legitimate explanation, is that probably one of the reasons why I thought I could multitask is that from a very young age, I thought that I could engage with multiple devices because I did grow up with technology and different devices. And so I did not know any different. And so maybe these foundations were laid at a very young age, and I dare say they are. And there's a huge debate going on at the moment around how particular phones, I'm thinking of mobile phones in particular, are an unnecessary distraction. And I'm glad that most schools had now come to the realisation through research, thankfully, and the research backs this up, is that it is an unnecessary distraction, particularly when it comes for learning. And there are other complications that go with that. But I think the research is pretty clear that attention shifting results in work becoming fragmented. We already know it drains cognitive resources, and it's just bad for productivity and can lead to stress, which can over time have a negative impact on our physical health and mental well-being. When you take that all in consideration, and we know that distractions can be detrimental for learning, I really think it is a bit of a no-brainer that we do away with mobile phones, at least, particularly during school time or any time we're learning. And so there is a question mark around what that means for universities. However, universities are not schools. They're not primary or secondary schools. And so we have a complicating dimension that we have basically adults, young adults, who are independent, mature learners. Can we trust them enough to avoid unnecessary distractions? Now, this is just a debate. I'm not saying I have an answer here, and nor would I ever want to regulate or outlaw mobile phones at a university. So let me just be very clear. I'm not saying that at all. I'm saying that that there are a range of very complicating factors here that are worth thinking about. By now, you're probably wondering what causes distraction, or what are some of the underlying forces of distraction. Now, what I found useful is there are 4 things that I want to bust. I want to do a bit of myth busting right now around modern myths about our distraction. And there are 4 of them that I want to go through with you now, because I think it's actually quite useful and will help us understand a little bit more of causes of distraction, or if you like, some of the underlying forces of distraction. So let's go through these. So there are 4 modern myths that have arisen around our relationship with the computing technology or the digital world today. And these are just popular narratives. So think about narratives, and thankfully science has proven them false. So the first myth, if you like, is that we should always strive to be focused when on our computers. And in that way, we can be productive. So this idea that we can just sit there for 6 to 8 hours a day, uninterrupted and being productive, that is just massive myth. Boom, smash it. Smash that myth down. Get a hammer and smash it down. Now, we should feel guilty. This idea that we should feel guilty if we're not focused. Get a hammer and smash it. Sorry, I just can't help myself. I just want to I feel like just getting a hammer and wanting to smash some of these myths as I go along. I just go, boom, smash it. But it turns out that focusing for lengthy periods of time, especially without breaks, look, it's not natural for people to focus for long periods of time. We already know attention spans around 47 seconds. Now, that has massive implications here around how we stay focused. And I'll talk a little bit more about how we can improve on that in a minute. People's attention just naturally flows, ebbs and flows. And there are times during the day when we are at our peak focus, and there are just other times it's not at all. And that's just life. It's a bit of just a reality of life in general. The second myth is that the flow is the ideal state we should strive for when we use our technologies. Flow is a term that was developed by the psychologist Csikszentmihalyi. Now that is a tricky surname to say. Flow is that optimal state of attention where we are so caught up in an experience that we lose touch with the outside world and we are unaware that time has passed. For instance, when I'm doing these podcasts, I've been here for a minute or two, and before I know it, 45 minutes, an hour or more is gone. Time just flies. And there are a whole heap of other examples, but I just use that example because there is a temporal component where we just lose track of time and we lose track of the outside world. And so what I want you to do is get your hammer in a minute, your metaphorical hammer here, but the idea of flow is a fine ambition. It really is. Except that flow is rare in everyday lives, especially if you happen to be a knowledge worker. And what that means is that your job primarily deals with using digital information. So there are many instances where it's not required or needed. So I'm going to get the hammer out and smash it up. Boom. While it's not uncommon for flow to occur. Now, I'm not saying it doesn't occur from time to time, but it's more likely to occur if you're an artist or you're a dancer, musician, woodworker, athlete, or you're doing some kind of creative enterprise. And so just for most of us, look, flow rarely happens in the workplace. But this idea that that's our magical kind of benchmark and that in order to be productive and get attention, I need to be in flow all the time. Let's just smash it. It's not the computer per se that hinders flow. It's more about the nature of one's job. You might easily experience flow if you compose music on your computer. Producer Luke, the truckie from Petrie, who is a muso, has told me many, many times how he's experienced flow when he's creating music himself. And I understand that from my own personal experiences. But it's unlikely in your job, particularly if you're just scheduling meetings or you're just writing reports. So that's why I just say to you, I think we just need to kind of get out of that idea that in order to be productive or regain attention, I need to be in that flow state. Now, the third myth is that distractions, interruptions, multitasking we experience while on our devices are generally to notifications we receive and our own lack of discipline. Boom, we self-interrupt. Now, that surprised me. Oh, here's me just thinking, it's all external. I just turn my notifications off on all my devices and I lock myself in a room without any distractions. No, it's not going to matter too much at all. I'm still going to self-sabotage, if you like, with my own self-interruptions. The key here is to think that we do not use technology in a vacuum. That's pretty clear. And our behaviors in the physical world are influenced by the culture we live in it. And so similarly, our behaviors in the digital world are also influenced by the environmental, social, and technological forces. So, yes, of course, these are essentially what I'm calling learned behaviors. These are learned behaviors. And the good news about that, well, you could say these poor learned behaviors, or if you like, bad habits, they might be perceived as a bad thing. Yeah, of course they are, if they are negatively or they produce negative outcomes for you. But the good news, I would say, is that you can, if it's a learned behavior, you can unlearn them. That's the good news. That's the good news. So that's why I say to you, you can unlearn some of these bad behaviors or negative habits. All right, the fourth one that's widely shared is that rote mindless activity that we do on our own computers and phones has no value. In fact, it actually does have some value. If I'm on some kind of game or I'm watching Luke Nichols again on YouTube, Outdoor Boys love your work, Luke, by the way, that's a bad thing. I feel guilty. I go, I feel guilty. Well, no, not necessarily. So this narrative that we tell ourselves that we need to, kind of cut out mindless activity like playing silly puzzle games or browsing social media or even surfing the internet so that we can be productive. The short answer is that yes, if we are wasting time and we head down a rabbit hole, say of social media, when we have other things to do, then yeah, that is negative. That is a problem, without a doubt. However, if I'm just taking a short break and it's replenishing my cognitive resources, then that can be a good thing. So rote activities, for instance, can actually be really important as part of breaks. So this attention trap, so it's important to take short breaks and do rote activity intentionally in order to bring about moderate relaxation. Now, there's a key here is that you need to manage it properly so it does become positive as opposed to negative. And there's a real reason why people are drawn to such rote activity is because at the end of the day, it makes them happy. There's a strong positive emotional valence that we associate with these activities. So we are the happiest when our attention is for easy, it's engaging, it's just not challenging or stressful. So just letting our minds wander while we take breaks with easy tasks, and then, and that could be both online and in the physical world. So it could just help us replenish our scarce resources. I didn't realize at the time what I was doing was actually this rote activity helped me, but I like to go have a break and I like to sweep my driveway. I find that unbelievably relaxing. I just thought, here I am, I'm just tidying up the front of the yard. But little do I know is that that's a perfect break. In fact, I have actually found that when I sweep the front driveway, not only do I feel relaxed, but I actually become quite creative and I think of all sorts of things. This is also the same when I go for walks. So I'm going to do an episode on physical activity and walking as well. But I find it absolutely amazing that some of my most creative ideas are actually in these moments of walking and also sweeping my front driveway. And the research shows that. I just discovered it purely by coincidence. Let me just finish here before we start moving on to the next section. But look, our attention in the digital world is affected by many things. So it can be affected by the work we do, the amount of cognitive resources we have available to us. It can be affected by the time of the day. It can be affected by our stress levels, the quality of our sleep, and look, a whole range of other factors. If we buy into this idea that distractions are primarily our own fault, then we ignore the fact that we are part of a larger socio-technical culture that exerts humongous influence on our behaviour. And this is where I make a couple of points before we go to where I'm talking about how we can regain our attention in the digital world. But I just want to leave you with some things to think about. So, without a doubt, the rise of the internet has also led to a decline in our focus, attention. But I just want to leave you some things to think about and how the media, if you like, or social media conditions our attention. All right, so think about it like this. I mentioned before emotional valence and our associations, particularly positive associations. Just think happiness, right? I feel happy when I'm doing something on social media, and we build up these positive emotional valences and we associate them with some of the things that we are doing. And so when you combine that with those joyous or happy associations, you can understand how we continue to go back to, for instance, social media. It makes us happy, and the level of demand is low. Okay. It also, when you combine that with mind wandering, and you combine that with what happens on the internet, and our attention can be directed to a whole range of different type of things. And I just think of just recently, for instance, I'm looking at buying a 2-person hiking tent. I'm going to go camping soon. So I've been looking at a 2-person hiking tent. But little did I know that this hiking tent has been following me around. And so what I'm saying is that there are certain algorithms that automatically pick up on your search history, and follow you around. So, for instance, for the last 2 to 3 weeks, I've had nothing but pop-ups come up on my devices. And it's uncanny how this happens, but it's not actually uncanny at all. It's actually by design in the different algorithms that occur in the background. And so that's why I say that this two-person tent has been following me around for weeks. So I remember I spent, I can't remember, a good 20, 30 minutes, searching for different types of two-person tents. And then I've narrowed it down to about 3 tents. And I was, doing some research around each one. Obviously I care about price because you can really spend a lot of money if you wanted to. And of course I don't want to spend thousands of dollars on a two-person tent, but nor do I want a cheap tent that will break after 1 or 2 uses. And so I've been doing a bit of research, but then of course the length of the time I've been on these pages and the algorithms that go in the background have now been following me around. And so I at least am consciously aware of what's going on. But what I'm saying is that how the social media or the media that we consume or use basically influences our usage. The computer, or if you like the algorithm in this case, is priming my cues. I have all these pop-ups that are trying to take me to a two-person tent. They are, yes, they're distractions. And so really what I'm saying is that the design of the internet is actually meant to be attention shifting. It tries very hard and works, I would say, very successfully at grabbing our attention and then putting positive emotional valences to what it is that we're looking at. In fact, Facebook is a perfect example. They do that very, very successfully with our social interactions. In fact, it takes the notion of social interactions and connectedness and works overtime to keep you on that page where possible. And so you might have experienced, whenever someone makes a post, you get the email notification, or you might get an automatic email, producer Luke, the truckie from Petrie, has changed his profile picture. And then, of course, if you're not disciplined enough, you might go and have a look at it because you want to have a look at how the profile picture that producer Luke has put up. So you could see how that could just burn your time and you could end up down a rabbit hole very, very quickly. And so that's why I think sometimes it's actually quite useful to understand how the digital world shapes our attention. And so I think it helps to be mindful of that, particularly if we are trying to regain our attention where possible. So let's just finish up now. And I want to finish by talking about practical ways we can regain our attention in a distracted world. And I think that's a perfect segue. So let's turn to that now. So by now you're probably wondering, how can I regain my attention in a digital world? That's obviously a logical question to ask. And so what I did is I started to seriously reconsider my relationship with various digital devices. No, I really did. And it's been an ongoing journey and challenge. And I can't say I have all the answers, and nor can I say it's like a bed of roses. However, I have made some progress. And I've made progress through some of the following. I'm going to share some of them with you. So we need to reframe our goal from that of maximizing human productivity with our devices to instead seeing them and maintaining them as a healthy psychological balance while still achieving our aim. So what I mean by that is that I need to just see them as a tool. But what I do care about was just more about this emphasis on balance. And that really has been my mantra here, is balance, balance, balance. And so what do I mean by balance? Okay, well, the type of balance I have in mind is often referred to as internal psychological balance, or what's referred to in the literature is psychological homeostasis. So what does that mean? Well, the autonomous nervous system controls certain body processes and is comprised of 2 parts. So we've got the parasympathetic and the sympathetic system. So the parasympathetic system regulates the rest and digest functions when the body is relaxed. For instance, it lowers the heart rate and controls digestion. And then we have the sympathetic system, on the other hand, and that's associated with fight or flight reaction. The research is conclusive. I just want to hands down just say to you that multitasking, With its rapid attention shifting, interruptions, and too much sustained focus, it results in stress. And when this happens over a long time, it definitely creates too much dominance of the sympathetic nervous system. It puts it into overdrive. Now, if the sympathetic system dominates over the parasympathetic system, then the body strays into fight or flight state. And sometimes it can stay there for long periods of time, which is not good for you. And over a long period of time, that can lead to really bad health outcomes for you. So why this matters is really simple, because when our autonomous nervous system is in balance, we can perform better, our mood improves, we can feel content, we can feel happy and energetic. So this is why it matters. And we also need to remember that our attention also has a rhythm. And so sometimes we have the resources to be deeply focused and sometimes not so much at all. So it's a little bit of self-awareness here matters. Keep thinking of your internal gauge, or the fuel tank if you like, and recognize when your tank is full and ready for hard creative work. It sounds simple. I know it sounds so simple, but it's not. I understand it is a real challenge. But also when you need to stop and replenish and refuel the tank. So using different types of attention purposefully while considering your responses can help you achieve your goals and still maintain an internal psychological balance. Now that's the theory. Let's start looking at some of the practical things you can actually do. You can regain control of your attention through the following: intentionality, forethought, self-regulation, and self-reflection and corrective behavior. So let's go through those. So learning how to practice what that's called meta-awareness of your actions is a really powerful technique for bringing your attention and actions to a conscious level that enables you to be more intentional in your choices. For example, before you go, say, to a social media site, ask yourself the following: what value will I gain by going there? If you're already there, you can ask yourself this: how much time have I spent here already? Am I gaining any value by staying here? So when you use meta-awareness, you switch your frame of mind from being a passive one to an active user of your attention. I found that asking those type of questions helped me regain control of my attention. It really did. Second one is using forethought. That's another practical tool I use to regain my attention. So forethought means imagining or visualizing how your current actions might affect your future. So this also makes you conscious and intentional in your behavior. Before you go on social media or play that online game, just spend a moment to think ahead and imagine what your end of the morning or end of your day might look like if you indulge or go down a social media rabbit hole. For me, you inevitably ends in exhaustion, headache, migraine, and just generally feeling terrible. Next one is self-regulation through changing your structures. So the next step to regain your attention relates to self-regulation by changing the types of structures that affect your attention, by changing your environment so as to remove unnecessary distractions or things that you might know will distract you. For example, for me, you might want to turn off your notifications on your phone. You might want to place your phone on Do Not Disturb mode. In fact, most smartphones have those functions, and I would encourage you, if you want to be productive and attend to something, use these modes on your phones. Now, if that's really problematic, and I know some people just can't help but seeing their phone in their eyesight, if that's a real problem and a distraction, then you might want to put your phone in another room, or you might want to place it in a drawer. Whatever works for you, I say you need to try it. That's the important thing here. The next one is you need to think strategically and plan when you intend to use social media, surf the web, shop online, or play the game. So I'm not saying completely remove any use of social media, surfing the web, playing games, whatever. In fact, no, I'm not saying that at all. In fact, what I'm saying is that you need to be strategic about your use. For instance, you might want to think about, all right, I'm going to do 10 minutes of social media now before I schedule an appointment. Because I know then when the appointment comes, it's an external prompt for me to stop. So you might be at a dentist appointment and you might come a bit early, and while you're in the waiting room, you just might want to look at some social media before the appointment. And the good news is that if you strategically plan it, you know that external stimulus, for instance, your appointment, your dentist will come out and get you, and then off you go to get grinded on your teeth. Probably not a good example because dentists generally have a negative emotional valence, but maybe it could be a soothing effect. So maybe the social media can help you soothe yourself before you get drilled on. Now, self-regulation through not switching your screen. So sometimes it's best not to indulge the temptation, particularly if you know that it will suck you down a rabbit hole of no return. So if you know YouTube watching is a problem for you, then you can help self-regulate by not switching your screen to YouTube. And that's what I did with the Outdoor Boys. What I do is that I know that if I start watching it, and some episodes can go from 30 minutes up to an hour and a half, I just know that if it's a long video, that I just won't go there because I'll be sucked down that rabbit hole. The last practical step to regain your attention is self-reflection and correcting your behavior by changing your mindset about how you use social media and how you plan your day around your cognitive resources and emotions so you can keep your goals concrete and conscious in mind. For example, you can plan your day to achieve balance by knowing your own rhythm. This is what I did. I got very, very serious about planning my day, and I do. So plan your day by thinking about how your tasks will impact your cognitive resources. So if you can, and I'm not saying all of us can do this, but because I can, and if you can, I'd still encourage you to do this, do not schedule one meeting right after the other. That just is a recipe for disaster, and that will drain your resources and you'll be exhausted by lunchtime. Ideally, design your day based on your own rhythm of attention, knowing your peak times or windows of focus for difficult and challenging tasks that require your full attention. So for most people, peak times are around 11 a.m. That's the first one in the morning. And then the second one is in the afternoon, mid-afternoon, around 3 o'clock. Now, for me, I know one peak window is around 10 a.m. in the morning, and I know my second peak window is around 2 p.m. in the afternoon. Now, after each window, the key is to replenish your cognitive resources with some rote activity, or even better, physical activity like a walk. So if I know I need to focus on something and it requires my full and undivided attention and focus, then I would definitely make sure I block that first window at 10 o'clock. And then I need to make sure at least I have one break between the morning window and the afternoon window. So that for me is anything from having lunch, which is a really important part of any break. And then obviously I might go for a short walk, or I might sweep the front driveway, or do some other kind of rote-related activity. Now this is the key. The key is not to do email during your peak times or windows, as that would only deplete your cognitive resources, or you'll waste them, basically. And so at the end of the day, remember, email creates stress, and it's best done when you're not at your peak. Of course, you also have the emotional valence attached to it, which is overwhelmingly negative. So I say that's when you want to do them, when you're not in any of those windows. Don't waste those valuable cognitive resources on email. Also, plan your day to include negative space or time to replenish your cognitive resources. So that could be with rote activities or easy tasks that will make you feel positive and bring you a reward. That's really important. Yes, that rote activity I was saying about sweeping my front driveway, yes, it's relaxing, it's a rote activity, but it also gives me great joy and brings a reward, because you start with something that's messy and then you end up with something that's clean. So you actually end up with a tangible outcome that you can not only see, and it brings a certain reward of positivity. Making time to replenish your cognitive resources is crucial for achieving a balance, and just as important as work itself. So with practice, you will get to know your rhythm and your attentional capacity. It's also worth remembering that your task that you do have an emotional valence. For instance, the emotional quality associated with doing them makes you feel positive and negative. So I've already told you about how when I sweep the front driveway, it definitely has a positive emotional valence for me. For a task that you know you have to do that brings a negative valence, for instance, for me and most people, it's email, that can be very draining. I would encourage you to change the time when you do them, say before lunch or before a scheduled break, or even a task that brings positive emotions. I would say do them before you know you're going to have a task that brings a positive emotion. Research is quite clear that handling emails without a doubt elicits negative emotions. For me, it was about just doing it once a day and then limiting the time I'm on my emails. I mean, if I really wanted to, I could spend days and days and days chained to my emails, and that's it. Of course, my productivity and the things that I need to do would be all put on the back burner, and I'd never get anything done. So I'm on the home stretch. There's two final things that I want to mention. One's called the Pomodoro technique. And so I want to provide you with a practical breakdown of this technique now. And the steps are quite easy to follow. So you need to choose a task. So you need to select a specific task to focus on. And then you need to set a timer and set that timer for 25 minutes. You need to work on that task without any distractions for 25 minutes and then take a short break. So after that 25 minutes, you need to take a 5-minute break. And then you need to repeat that work and break cycle 4 times. 4 times. And then after the 4th time or the 4th interval, you need to take a longer break, so of 15 to 30 minutes. Now, you could go one step further, and one step further is that you record each session. So you keep a track of your sessions just to monitor your progress and identify any areas for improvement. Now, that is definitely worth trialing. If you really are struggling with your attention, I would encourage you to go to that technique first. Now, the second intervention I want to share with you is a story of Andy. Andy is a student. It's someone I know very closely. This story is a little bit left of center, but it's an interesting one because it revolves around an intervention treatment called neurofeedback therapy. Now, I've spoken to Andy at length about neurofeedback therapy. What essentially happens is that it's a technique that trains the brain to utilizing rewards to modify behavior, which is basically referred to as operant conditioning, through in-the-moment displays of brain activity in order to teach individuals how to self-regulate what is happening in their brain. And so the brain function is commonly captured via an encephalogram or EEG technology. So essentially what happens is that there are 3 electrodes placed on each earlobe and then 1 electrode placed about 10 centimeters above the right ear. And obviously it monitors your brainwave function while you're on the device. So during a neurofeedback session and provides pretty much in the moment feedback to the person who's actually doing the neurofeedback, allowing them to learn to regulate their brainwaves. Now, the goal of neurofeedback is to help individuals learn to control their brainwave patterns, and with one of the main benefits being improved focus and attention. In fact, it is one of the known benefits. I just say to you, don't rule it out. It is something that is really, really useful, particularly if you seriously struggle with your focus and attention. Let's recap on some of the main points. When it comes to attention, it's important to remember that we have limited cognitive resources each day. And so we need to be selective about what to focus our attention on each day. In other words, we can control what we pay our attention on. Now, I wanted to leave you with a few takeaways. Across all jobs, we have 2 peak times of focus, or what I call windows of focused attention. So if you know you have something that requires a lot of cognitive load or attention, then I would encourage you to do them through one of these windows or both. When it comes to multitasking, the evidence consistently shows that productivity declines and suffers, and studies have consistently shown that multitasking is associated with higher stress. The faster the attention's switching between devices, the higher the stress, which is a contributing factor for burnout and detrimental to our physical and mental health and well-being. Next one, Meaningful and frequent breaks are crucial if we want to regain our attention. In fact, I would say they're necessary. They're a must. This means we need to leave our devices in order to replenish our cognitive resources where possible. In fact, I would encourage you, if you want the best bang for dollar, is to leave your device completely. You will get the biggest benefit as part of your break. It's important to remember that short breaks that involve rote activity is part of this equation. I do realize some of these rote activities can be online. However, if you want the best bang for your dollar and you want a real gain quickly, I would encourage you to leave your device completely. However, if you want to do something online, then a game like Candy Crush or some kind of rote activity can also help. But I would encourage a physical break, like going for a walk. But when it comes to distractions, these are partially our own fault in doing. Now, that is a bitter pill to swallow. I understand that is tough. The good news about that is that it means that you're in control of what you attend to. You can actually do something about it. And we can regain control of our attention by removing or limiting some of these distractions. Now, you can put your phone on Do Not Disturb mode. There's nothing stopping you from doing that. Now, I think I might leave it there. Thanks for listening, and don't forget to subscribe. Until next time, stay curious and think deeply. Whew. Now I'm cooked. I'm sorry, but yeah.
I was actually thinking of when you were talking about, the peaks and the troughs of the tension of the day. And it's like, I was thinking, I'm going to troughing or peaking right now.
Yeah.
Heading toward the trough.
Oh yeah. Yeah, very much so. Very much so. So I'm going to hit stop. A huge thank you to my amazing producer, Luke Watson, aka Producer Luke. Your endless support, creativity, and hard work make this podcast possible. This has been a Jazz Flute Media production.